It's a Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, and Derrick Rose has parted ways with the Memphis Grizzlies. Not an outright waiver. That's important to point out. I'm going to explain some details on that significance, plus what comes next for the Memphis Grizzlies and what's next for Derrick Rose now that he is no longer a member, reportedly, of the Memphis Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax. This is Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I am Joe Mullinax. This is Locked On Grizzlies, and we appreciate you being with us each and every time an episode drops here at Locked On Grizzlies, a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. No DeMichael Cole with me this time around because it is busy, as you have probably gathered there in Memphis, Tennessee. The news, somewhat unexpected news that Derrick Rose has been waived by the Memphis Grizzlies. At least that was the report for Shams Charania of The Athletic. But we are going to provide some context here to that, which is very important after talking with my good buddy DeMichael Cole, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer of the Commercial Appeal. It's not quite that simple, and I'll explain what I mean here momentarily. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Again, we're free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Check us out on YouTube, Apple, Amazon, Spotify. Like, subscribe, take us with you on the go, whether you're working out, whether you're in the car, hanging out at work, taking a break, watching on your phone, whatever the case might be, whether it's audio or visual, make sure you're subscribing and being an everydayer with us here at Locked On Grizzlies. I hinted at the end of yesterday's show that I was going to be very excited, dear listener, dear viewer, to finally get to debate my good buddy DeMichael Cole, because he remains, I'm sure, even now, a Derrick Rose stan. And I can't fault him. As I said on the show on Monday, he grew up with the guy. This is a Memphis Tiger legend who finally came to Memphis, Tennessee to be a Grizzly and perhaps finish out his career in Beale Street Blue. Very exciting times for those that came of age in an era of Memphis Tiger basketball that special. No judgment here on that front. But I do want to, before I declare victory, because this is kind of a moment of victory for me in terms of Derrick Rose no longer being on the Memphis Grizzlies, I do want to stress that a report that was made by Shams Charania is not entirely accurate after talking with folks, including my good buddy DeMichael Cole. I want to stress that's my main point of conversation. Very busy, not able to be with us on this episode, but he did want me to pass along some intel to you, dear listener, dear viewer, at the very least, some clarity on what exactly is going on. So the report was from Shams that the Grizzlies waived Derrick Rose. The team has not announced that yet. I'll talk later on in the show about why that might be, right? This hasn't been an officially declared moment in time where the team has moved on from Rose. And that leads me to believe that led me to believe before I talked to DeMichael, that it wasn't as simple as Memphis a week before training camp opens, which is significant. We'll talk more about that later on in the show too. A week before training camp opens, they say, we're done with this Derrick Rose guy. Now me, dear listener, dear viewer, I would most certainly do that. And I'm not going to have a chance now to have the trial of Derrick Rose like we were going to, because the case is over. Derrick Rose is no longer a member of the Memphis Grizzlies, reportedly. But Derrick Rose's inability to stay on the floor, Derrick Rose's injury concerns over the last several seasons, he has not played more than 35 games in an NBA season since COVID was a thing. And it's been a while since COVID was the big thing, right? I understand COVID still exists, but he has played in the last 4 seasons, or last 3 seasons. With the Knicks, with the Knicks, he played 26 games in 2021, 2022. With the Knicks in 2022, 2023, he played 27 games. With the Grizzlies, he played 24 games. That's not enough basketball games, right? This is a guy who put up decent numbers last year, showed some flashes of his ability to be crafty with the ball in his hands, get to the basket, even now, right? In his age 35 season this past year, to be able to go out and get to the rim, not quite at ease. I don't think that's a fair way to describe it. But with the propensity that Rose was still able to do it, it's impressive considering all of the issues that he had with his knees, considering all the concerns, dating back 15 years now. We forget that his rookie year was the 2008-2009 Chicago Bulls. This dude has been around for a minute. And we forget that, or at least I forget that. And it's easy to chalk it up to him being washed and just kind of moving along. And I do think he's washed. I don't get it twisted. I hope that Derrick Rose understands how much he means to people like DeMichael Cole, my partner on this podcast, and the way that DeMichael takes in basketball. Because DeMichael's not alone in that, right? DeMichael's not alone in that. I didn't grow up in Memphis, Tennessee. I lived there for 3 years, fell in love with the Grizzlies, and even now, a decade after leaving the city, physically, I am still active virtually in what goes around with the Memphis Grizzlies in terms of media. It's because I loved the city that much and because I enjoyed following the team that much. I get it from Memphians. The connection to Derrick Rose was strong then because when I lived in Memphis, Rose was having his tremendous all-star runs. He was dominant, and then he tore his knee up in his ACL, and things were never quite the same again, right? And that sucks. He had some blips, some flashes, 6th man of the year kind of stuff in Minnesota, did some good things in Detroit. He was in those conversations. He was in the mix. But he was never the MVP, the youngest MVP in NBA history again. Like, that didn't happen for Derrick Rose after that ACL injury. But he was special. He was elite. He was somebody that did things with the basketball in his hands in terms of speed and agility and finishing we haven't seen since until, maybe Russell Westbrook or one Ja Morant. But those are guys that are really kind of a cut above in terms of their athleticism, meshing with the game and the skill set of handling the ball. And Derrick Rose was one of the best I've ever seen do that. And he played for Memphis. He was a Memphis Tiger. He helped lead the Tigers to this very important place. So for me, the fact that DeMichael wanted to make sure that it was clear that this was not an outright waiving. The Grizzlies weren't saying, this guy is done, we don't want him on our roster anymore. I would do that. The Grizzlies did not do that. This was Derrick Rose. This was a buyout agreement. Okay, Derrick Rose wanted out of his contract. Now, why would he do that? We'll talk more about later on in the show. Maybe he has another landing spot in mind. Maybe he wants to finish his career elsewhere. Maybe his career is finished, right? We'll talk more about that. There's lots of possibilities here that we can kind of speculate on. And I want to stress it is speculation. But it's important to point out that this was a buyout. Shams' report makes it sound like Memphis was just moving on. Rose wanted this. Rose wanted the opportunity to leave the team on his terms. And the Grizzlies obliged. And I think that matters because for people like me that think he can't play anymore, that would rather see Scottie Pippen Jr., we'll talk more about that here in a moment, I'd rather see him get those reps. I'd rather see him get that contract spot. Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. Who knows what comes next? But it's significant to point out that this was not a Grizzlies decision. This was a mutual to Derrick Rose decision to move on from the Memphis Grizzlies at this stage and leave the roster. So again, you'll note in our show notes, not saying that he was waived by the Memphis Grizzlies. While that might be technically true, this was a buyout agreement per our DeMichael Cole. And that's important to understand. There's a major difference there. Maybe Rose thinks he has more in the tank and he wants to prove that somewhere else. Maybe he thinks the tank is empty. We'll kind of speculate more later on in the program. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Memphis was taken by surprise by this? because I most certainly think they were taken by surprise. And I'm curious to see what you guys think, whether it's on X or in the comments. Hit me up at Joe Mullinax. I am curious to see how Memphis responds, and that'll be what we focus on next year on the show. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks over at Gametime. I love Gametime. I love making memories with my family. I love making memories at sporting events, at concerts, all these wonderful, fun things that you can do. And I want to make more memories in the next year or so. Gametime is a great way to do so. I want to stress that there's so many ways that Gametime makes the ticket buying experience easier, like all-in pricing. You can toggle this feature that has to be turned on before you can see it. Before you can see the all-in pricing, you got to toggle it on. But it shows the total up front. There's no surprise fees at checkout. You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, plus the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. I am intrigued by what this means for Memphis, right? Because I never really was a Derrick Rose guy, all things told. And again, I hope DeMichael gets a chance to come on here in the next couple of days and talk about what Rose meant to him as someone who came of age basketball-wise in the city of Memphis, where Derrick Rose obviously has legendary status. That was not my experience. As someone who consumes the Grizzlies in a different way, what comes next? I can only assume it's going to be better. Right, I can only assume that it's going to be an improvement, because Derrick Rose, while he showed flashes offensively, was a traffic cone in a lot of ways defensively. He did not have it anymore in terms of that lateral movement to be able to stay in front of defenders. And that didn't really happen in New York either. This is a guy in Derrick Rose who would, the last few seasons, before he, was washed up, in my opinion, in New York, 0.8 steals a game, 0.9 steals a game. This is a guy who per 100 possessions was able to do a lot of things still defensively. 1.7 steals per 100 possessions his last year in New York, or second to last year in New York. Then it dropped to 1. There was a noticeable drop-off in his productivity there, a noticeable drop-off in his rebounding, a noticeable drop-off in so many areas. Yeah, he shot better in Memphis, but where's the value defensively? It was his worst defensive season in terms of defensive rating at 119 for the Grizzlies. He just couldn't keep it going any longer on that end of the court. Scottie Pippen Jr. can get it, right? And that is where I hope Memphis goes. And, DeMichael may claim victory. I claimed victory on X when the news broke, and I tagged DeMichael, and he said, not so fast. Maybe this is to bring in a Scottie Pippen Jr. and bring him up to the full roster. And that would get them to the 14 again, now that Rose reportedly is no longer on the team. And they could sign another two-way guy, right? That's a possibility. It's also possible that they keep an eye on the waiver wire. They bring in somebody to compete for this spot, maybe two guys to compete. They have 2 open roster spots reportedly now. Maybe you sign 2 guys that are currently free agents and let them duke it out and waive somebody at the end of the preseason. That's possible too. I'm building up to my speculation about what happens next for D Rose. The Memphis Grizzlies, even if they're doing right by Rose in this buyout and letting him end his career where he wants, how he wants, whatever the case might be, it's really hard for me to believe, dear listener, dear viewer. I'm a lot of things, okay? I'm loud, I'm sweaty. I'm not dumb. I don't think this was in the plan, if that makes sense. And again, I want to speculate here. I don't have insider knowledge. When I talk to DeMichael, he gives me things that he can confirm that, I'm able to share. I don't have insider tips on this sort of stuff, but I have eyes and ears, and I've followed this team for a long time. It is a week before training camp opens. And regardless of my feelings about Derrick Rose, up until yesterday, he was on the roster as a full contracted player, unlike Scottie Pippen Jr. So one would tend to believe, especially at a position that DeMichael has pointed out numerous times, and it's very fair to, is potentially the most important one going into this season, given all that's transpired with Joe Morant. It's logical to assume that the Grizzlies were comfortable with him being that 12-minute-a-night backup point guard. That's gone now. And they almost certainly have to try to sit back and go, okay, what do we do next? And that is where this becomes even more speculative, because there is no precedent for this in terms of this Grizzlies team at this stage of the offseason. This team has been set in stone for months. The draft happens. They draft Zach Edey. They bring in Cam Spencer on a two-way deal. Jalen Wells. They did not go crazy in free agency. They brought Luke Kennard back. That was essentially it. This team looks very much similar to the team that was on the roster last season, including Derrick Rose. It felt like there was a plan. And something has happened over the last couple of weeks where the plan has been deviated from. Now, what does that look like when it comes to Rose? We'll talk more about that here in a moment. What does that look like in terms of Memphis? The easiest answer is converting Scottie Pippen Jr. from that two-way contract to a full-blown deal and putting him out there as the backup point. But DeMichael has said this, and I agree with him. Scottie Pippen Jr. showed flashes in Summer League. That's meaningless basketball. Scottie Pippen Jr. did good things when the season was already lost for Memphis, and he played a lot of basketball in those lost season minutes. Gigi Jackson at times was the best player on the floor for this Grizzlies team. That's not winning. That's not conducive to what these Grizzlies are trying to be as a contender in the Western Conference. So you're putting a lot of faith in that guy. I also think it something that's even, perhaps for me at least, more concerning than Scottie Pippen Jr. is the concept of Marcus Smart running the point more. And I just can't in good conscience think that the Grizzlies think that's a good idea, because we have so much of a sample size from last year showing that Smart can't do that. Now, maybe they think that Smart, the backup point guard, will be different in those minutes, those limited minutes of 12 or so, where he's asked to be that lead facilitator for a group that includes Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. But need I remind you, my beloved listeners and viewers, that we've seen this song and dance. We know what this team looks like when Ja Morant is not on the floor. Now, your counter might be, well, Brandon Clark wasn't there. There were times where Luke Kennard wasn't there. Zach Edey certainly wasn't there. And those are all fair points. You also have a different version of Vince Williams Jr. that is in that mix now. All understandable ideas to bring up in this conversation. But all I know is I would feel a heck of a lot better given this new circumstance if the Grizzlies were able to go and try to secure the services of another point guard. What does that look like? Sounds like a topic for another episode of Locked On Grizzlies, since this is still so fresh. Who could be options that are available, that are realistic via trade? It's a worthwhile question to ask. And is it that big of a deal when you consider the realities of having a top 10 MVP candidate, at least in terms of betting odds right now, in your employ? Should they be investing a lot in the backup point guard position? That was one of my arguments against Tyus Jones for the longest time. Why would you pay Ja Morant max money and then pay Tyus Jones $8 to $10 million a year for Tyus not to be able to play next to Ja and essentially be a substitute teacher? Because as I always point out, look at Tyus's numbers from his last year in Memphis. He was really good as a replacement starter for Ja, not so good as a true reserve point guard. There's a difference there. I would go with Scottie Pippen Jr. That's what I would do. It's the easiest thing. It's the cheapest thing. It allows for you to bring in another two-way guy. Scottie Pippen Jr. knows the scheme, understands the situation. That would be what I do. What would you do if you were the Memphis Grizzlies? Would you test the trade market? Would you wait to see who gets waived as preseason basketball continues and concludes in the next several weeks? I'm curious. Let me know at Joe Mullinax. Also hit me up in the comments. Make sure that you're checking out Locked On NBA as your second listen, your second watch. As soon as this episode is over, go check them out. They do a great job giving you a local feel with all of the wonderful news and coverage and analysis on the national level. Big fan of Locked On NBA, and I'm sure you will be as well. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Anywhere you get Locked On Grizzlies, you can get Locked On NBA. Make sure you check them out as soon as this show is over. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, I know you're excited. NFL football has returned, and you can start this season off right with a big return on FanDuel. That's America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, maybe you were watching Monday Night Football, you had a feeling about the Commanders or the Bengals, the Bills or the Jaguars, you want to fulfill that feeling. You can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and do so much more on the same exact page where you place your bets. And you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Football season is officially in full swing, and FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, has got you covered there. Again, that's FanDuel.com. Go check them out as soon as you can. We're going to close this episode, and I want to stress this is speculative. Okay, this is all speculation. I don't have an inside source. DeMichael wanted me to make sure I made it clear that this was a buyout. This was not the Grizzlies moving on from Derrick Rose. If anything, this was Derrick Rose wanting to move on from Memphis, right? But I also don't feel like it was something that the Grizzlies did wrong. Because where else in the NBA, and this is going to sound like a backhanded compliment, where else in the NBA is Derrick Rose going to get the opportunity that has been presented to him in Memphis to be a true backup point guard? I don't know of any other team in the NBA off the top of my head that should do that. Maybe Rose wants to go back to Chicago and he wants to have some closure there. Maybe that's where he wants it to end, is with the Bulls. Maybe that's a team that could perhaps use some help in their backcourt in terms of depth. That would logically make sense. I could see that happening. I could see him wanting to go somewhere where he can get a chance at a championship. Maybe he thinks Memphis is not that. Maybe he thinks Denver. Maybe he thinks another spot that might have an open roster spot. Maybe they waive somebody. A Los Angeles, a Boston, clearly. Maybe he wants to go ring chasing, and he's not sure that the Grizzlies can be that for him. Or, and again, this is pure speculation, maybe Derrick Rose just thinks it's time to stop playing basketball. What's really gotten me thinking about this, and we talked about Adrian Wojnarowski stepping away from covering the NBA last week, his decision that he's reached a point in his life where he doesn't have the drive to do the job at the level that it's required to do it, to be him, to be Woj. That takes a heck of a lot of self-awareness. And I wonder if Derrick Rose is executing some self-awareness. Maybe he knows after a year in Memphis, after seeing what his body has been through, all the stuff he has to do to be healthy. DeMichael has talked about here on Locked On Grizzlies. He doesn't do a ton of 5-on-5 open session work in the offseason because he's trying to keep his knees. He's trying to keep his health. He's trying to keep those mileage numbers down on him at times where he's physically capable to do so. He has a wife and he has kids. Maybe he's reached that point where he doesn't want to endure that anymore. And who can blame him, right? Certainly not me. This is a guy who's around my age. I'm 37 years old. He's a little bit younger than me. And I, on a much smaller scale, can identify with the feeling of, can I still do this, right? Do I have the mental drive? Forget the physical aspect. To be what Derrick Rose has been, a 15 or so year NBA pro, to do what you have to do for your body, to do what you have to do in terms of leaving your family for an extended period of time. All that has to be extremely difficult. The competitor in Derrick Rose, and my understanding of him as a competitor, I could totally see him trying to go somewhere where he can win at a high level. I believe he could do that in Memphis. And again, when you combine that opportunity with the role that he was going to play, because again, the Grizzlies have to figure something out now. That's what makes me pause. That's what makes me think that this is bigger than him wanting to go somewhere else. This happened a week before training camp opened. They had months of time. It's not like Derrick Rose all of a sudden in September became washed, right? They had time to make roster moves. They could have done other things. They didn't. They saw Derrick Rose as the guy that was going to help them this season. Until he isn't. And I find it hard to believe, given how well the Grizzlies have treated veteran players in the past, the way that they've given them what they wanted. And it sounds like this has happened here again. Again, DeMichael wanted me to stress this was a buyout. This was not a waiving where Memphis thinks that Derrick Rose is bad and can't do it anymore. Derrick Rose wanted this. He wanted to leave the Grizzlies. But it doesn't seem like something where there's anger or frustration. And it's important to point out that as of this recording, there's been no official announcement from the Memphis Grizzlies. Usually when someone gets waived, that comes out pretty close to that time, which adds even more evidence to what DeMichael has told us. Derrick Rose's next step, being away from Memphis, regardless of which direction it goes, puts the Grizzlies in a really tough spot at a position that is extremely significant. A lot of faith is being put in Joe Morant. You spent a lot of money, a lot of time. He's a top 10 MVP candidate right now, like we talked about yesterday. At some point, that guy's got to play to his capability if he's going to live up to those expectations. And he's going to have to play big minutes to live up to those expectations. You need someone to run the point. Marcus Smart, in my opinion, that's a bold strategy. Wouldn't be the choice I'd make. Desmond Bane, now we're getting closer, but that's not the strength of Bane. Scottie Pippen Jr. is what I would do. I would make him a full-time contract and sign another two-way guy. But to say, how do we know Derrick Rose is if we thought Derrick Rose was washed and couldn't do it, which is what I thought, how can you know for sure that Scottie Pippen Jr. is ready to do what Memphis needs him to do? And the truth of the matter is you don't. You don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty right now around this situation. And once you listen to or watch this podcast, it might be obsolete. Maybe Rose announces he wants to go finish his career in Chicago by the time you check out this episode. Maybe Rose announces his retirement by the time you check out this episode. I can't shake that feeling. And again, it's speculative. This is very sudden. That doesn't happen if you're contemplating wanting to go to a contender. If you look at Phoenix, Arizona and say, oh, the Suns could use a backup point guard because Tyus Jones is there in Phoenix, right? The Suns could use some help out there. Maybe I'll go try to be with Phoenix and go win a title. That would have happened a month or so ago. This is very sudden right now. So it's either a specific team like Chicago, I could see that, or maybe it's time to hang up the shoes. We'll find out soon enough, I'm sure, as Memphis parses through this new reality of having two roster spots, at least for the moment, as of this recording, open instead of one. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. An interesting episode, to say the least, talking about Memphis and Derrick Rose moving on from one another. Again, a buyout reached. Shams Charania of The Athletic reported Grizzlies waiving Rose. That is technically true, but DeMichael Cole, my partner here on Locked On Grizzlies, wanted to stress it was a buyout agreement. Derrick Rose reached out to the Grizzlies. He wanted this. That's important to understand. Scottie Pippen Jr., more Marcus Smart than I'd care to see. Maybe another name that we can talk about later on in the week. Lots of different ways this can go. And then as far as Rose himself, a return to a place like Chicago or a return to his wife and kids in retirement. That to me is what makes the most sense here. What makes the most sense for you is to join us on our Wednesday edition of the podcast. We'll talk about the Derrick Rose updates. Maybe there will be further movement on what Rose decides to do. We will also continue to look toward training camp, how the team's shaping up going into their trip to Nashville, the open practice that was announced for October 6th. Lots of different directions we can take going into our Wednesday edition of the show. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, literally anywhere you can get Locked On Grizzlies. You should subscribe and try to make us part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. Make sure you're checking out Locked On NBA after this episode concludes. Make sure that you're becoming an everyday or every time an episode drops, you're with myself and or DeMichael here on Locked On Grizzlies. Shout out to Derrick Rose. regardless, it's the end of your time in Memphis. I know how important you are to a lot of people in the city, and it's really cool that you had a chance to come back to Memphis, at least for a short time, and relive some of those memories and get back out on the court in FedEx Forum and really make people remember one of the reasons they fell in love with the game of basketball in the first place. For all my cynicism about you not being able to play anymore, it was cool to see folks that I respect and care about that are Grizzlies fans, DeMichael being included, to being the Grizzlies beat writer. It was cool to see them be excited for your return to Memphis. So thank you for that, Derrick. Whatever is next for you, I at least wish you the best. Until next time, I wish you the best, dear listener, dear viewer. We'll catch you next time, hopefully tomorrow, here on Locked On Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you get podcasts. We are free and available as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. This is Locked On Grizzlies.